All right, my name is Professor Chris Apelamian. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies here at Cal, and I'm also the chair of the Center for Research on Social Change. I want to thank you all for coming to the talk today. Before we begin, I want to make a quick announcement about the next event that we're having. Robin Marsh, who is a senior researcher here at the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues, will give a talk titled Career Choices, Return Paths, and Social Contributions, Findings from the African Alumni Project. And that talk will be here in this room on Thursday, October 13th from 12 to 1:30 p.m. I'd also like to thank the Center for Race and Gender Social Movement Working Group for helping sponsor this, as well as the Institute of European Studies. Before we begin, I also want to ask you all to please turn off your cell phones. And just to give you a sense of the format of today's talk, is Professor Ayoub will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for another few minutes to do a Q&A. So with that said, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Phillip Ayoub, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Politics at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Professor Ayoub received his PhD from Cornell University's Department of Government in 2013, and he also spent a year as a Max Weber Fellow in the Department of Politics and Social Science at the beautiful university, or European University Institute in Florence, Italy, which is pretty amazing. I've been there. Definitely check it out. They have amazing fellowships. His research bridges insights from the fields of international relations, comparative politics, with the focus on marginalized populations, social movements, transnational politics, norm diffusion, among other important topics. And the title of today's talk, which is based on his newly released Cambridge University book, titled When States Come Out, Europe, Sexual Minorities and the Politics of Visibility. So with that said, let's welcome Professor Ayoub.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the organizers so much, and it's a great pleasure to be here speaking at the center and obviously at the University of California, Berkeley. It's also one of the first talks I've given on the book. I obviously spent a long time thinking about this, but it's always weird with the book because there's that kind of phase for about a year and a half where you stop thinking about it and then it comes out and then you have to think about it again and talk about it. But this is really nice, and it's especially nice to do it also with my friend Chris Apelamian, who I went to graduate school with. Definitely influenced a lot of my thinking on social movements and about marginalized populations in world politics. So it's really great to be here. So thank you so much to all of you for the invitation. This book is about transnational social movements around LGBT rights. During the decade I was thinking about this topic. I would be surprised by some of the tremendous changes we've seen around the world. Like small island of Catholic Ireland would vote by popular majority to introduce same-sex marriage. The small Catholic island of Malta would become a trailblazer on trans recognition. There were a lot of really changes that I really didn't expect going into this project, and the book became kind of part of an investigation of this recent history of a transnational movement that has really taken the world by surprise in many instances, and how this issue has been diffused. And that's a little bit kind of what I want to talk about today. And I'm going to make the case that a politics of visibility has engendered the interactions between movements and states that empower marginalized people. It mobilizes actors to demand change. It influences the spread of new legal standards. And sometimes, if we're lucky, it weaves new ideas into the fabrics of societies. So I want to illustrate how norm visibility can empower marginalized groups, moving them to the center of political debate, from the margins to the center, and making it possible for them to obtain rights to which they have due claim. So LGBT rights, maybe in Europe more than anywhere else as a region, have become part of the global expansion of what we consider, human rights in recent years. That said, they remain really hotly contested among states. Many times they're seen by their opponents to challenge the very foundations upon which national identity rests. This is something that, for scholarship is kind of interesting, because some scholars have said we need to study clashes of social systems to understand how the world changes. So in that respect, this is kind of an interesting case for international relations. Poland, which is the case that at the end of the talk today, after showing you some patterns internationally that I'd like to return back to, is a case where I spend a lot of time. Most of these pictures are from my fieldwork in Poland. Poland is a country where in the year 2000, when surveyed, only 1 in 10 Poles mentioned ever having met a gay person. 10 years ago, there were still bills in front of Parliament to remove LGBT people from their teaching positions in schools, and bans in various cities from Warsaw, Krakow, Łódź, Poznan, where various cities banned LGBT people from marching, even though Poland is a country that is well known for social movements and marches that have changed, really vastly changed the politics of the state. So this was definitely, kind of one of these cases, and Poland is certainly not the only case. It's just one that I happen to focus on in my work. It was one of these cases that the European norm, quote unquote, of LGBT rights had a hard time entering the discourse there. And in terms of social movement scholarship, the term that social movement scholars talk about, closed political opportunity structures, this was definitely for LGBT rights one of those cases. That said, LGBT activism did take place nonetheless, in part because Polish activists were really innovative in how they developed ties to transnational contexts and also pressuring the state from above. So this is, kind of a story about how local activists can channel transnational support to affect domestic politics, and a story about how norms can become salient, and also in this case, people can come out under broader conditions of visibility. So why do this study in Europe, or the European Union to be specific? So the EU is the only international organization where we have binding international laws around sexual orientation. That's Article 13 of the Amsterdam Treaty, and then we also have a series of non-binding, we have court rulings, and then a series of non-binding European Parliament resolutions around LGBT issues. So this has led some scholars, like Kelly Coleman's really pioneering work, to say that we see the development of an international norm around respecting the rights of LGBT people in the European Union. That said, while I think this is true, we see really strong variation across, even in a region as open to these rights as the EU, we see really strong variation across cases and the degree to which LGBT people are actually respected, both in terms of legal rights but also in terms of societal recognition. So part of the project here, and what I want to talk about in the book, is explaining, what accounts for this variation. So that variation leads to the question, the main question of the book, which is why are the trajectories of LGBT recognition so different across states? There's two ways that I look at that in the book. One is compliance, which is the degree to which states actually adopt laws protecting LGBT people. And the other is the more difficult process of internalization, which is the degree to which societies actually change how they view these populations. Since I don't have enough time to really do everything, I'm going to talk mainly about compliance, or I will talk about compliance and show you part of the analysis here today, and then I'm happy to answer some questions about the related process, related but different process of internalization in the Q&A, if it's interesting to anyone. So this question of, why do we have differences across states? There's a ton of scholarship that helps us gain traction on this question, but I argue that we have to rethink some of the previous explanations. A lot of the older explanations were focused on domestic factors. That's in part because of the methods that we had with which to study these issues. It's also in part because there weren't that many states that really had interesting legislation around these populations for quite some time. So we had a lot of factors like the religious cultural context, economic wealth and modernity, the development of the welfare state, organizing capacity of domestic social movements, levels of democratization, etc. These types of domestic explanations that were used to predict when states would adopt these types of legislations. And while this made a lot of sense for first movers like the Protestant Nordic countries or the or the Netherlands was one of those cases that a lot of these studies were based on. When we look at the new states that have incorporated these rights into their framework, some of these domestic explanations are muddled a little bit, because we see a slew of states that don't look very much like the first mover states that are adopting these issues. Multiple dozens of states have adopted some form of same-sex union in very short time periods. So there must be something international. And I think that's one of the core points that I want to add to that discussion, is that we should certainly think about domestic variables, which continue to be very important, but they shouldn't be looked at in isolation from how they interact with the international variables. And there's something international going on here that is helping explain this. So that, if we look then to international relations, and especially the work on the diffusion of norms, we have various explanations that don't account for the variation we look at here entirely. One is the idea that domestic resonance explains when norms diffuse. So basically norms diffuse to where they fit the most with the local context, which has led some critics to say that norms are just diffusing to where they're needed the least. But interesting enough, we do have surprising misfits that do change. We have Catholic countries like Spain and Portugal that become leaders on this issue. We also have equally secular countries like the Czech Republic and Latvia that react very different to the same norms. So the Czech Republic has advanced, has taken on much further on this issue. There's also weak democracies that move before strong democracies. So we do see a series of misfits that change. We also have this expectation that modernization correlates with the adoption of post-material values, and that also doesn't hold entirely when we look at the types of states that adopt this norm. And then there's a series of explanations that don't really account for variation in their theorizing, which is, for one, an idea that human rights norms are not costly in terms of material, so states should adopt them gladly because they don't actually have to do anything. But even though it might be very true that adopting LGBT rights norms aren't materially costly, they nonetheless provoke a lot of contestation, and societies and states feel pretty strongly about them. There's also ideas from the World Polity School. Theoretically, I draw from this school a lot, actually. It's the idea that we should see some kind of isomorphism around new international norms. That said, it doesn't really theorize agency and deliberation enough to account for the really strong types of variation that we see across cases. And then finally, there's the theories of the post-Soviet syndrome, which kind of expects that the bankruptcy of civil society would have kind of a uniform grip on the region. But even if we look at post-communist states in Europe, we see really strong variation in terms of how they've reacted to this norm. So that's also kind of not satisfactory on its own. So this is the variation that I've been talking about when it comes to the legal standing, and I know there's a lot going on this slide, and you don't have to make sense of all of it, except that this is an index that I put together of 12 different types of LGBT rights laws, that pro-LGBT rights laws that can deal with many different issues, from decriminalization, but also to parenting, partnership, anti-discrimination measures. And you see 3 different years, which is 1990, 2000, and then the yellow bar is 2010. And so you see a lot of variation across states in the European Union. These are the 27 EU states that were there until, so this analysis ended in 2010. So Croatia has joined since, and the UK might be leaving soon, but this is 27 is what we're looking at here. And I'm going to spend most of the time, or at least the analysis, the quantitative one I want to show you, deals mainly with new adopter states. So those are the new states that joined in the 2004 and 2007 waves of European integration. And the book deals a lot with some case studies. The ones I'll talk about today is kind of interactions between Germany and Poland, which we'll get to after I show you the broader patterns. So the argument I make is that differing degrees of visibility have produced different outcomes for socio-political change across states. So I think about this concept or develop this concept of norm visibility, which is the relative ability of publics and governments to see and interact with ideas and images that define, quote unquote, appropriate behavior in international norms. So it's acknowledging that an international norm might exist, but its felt intensity might vary by states. And to explain that variation, I'm interested in how states are connected to their international communities. And I look at three different types of channels. The first are political and social channels, which I'll get to in the next slide. And then the third is a brokered channel, which is the degree to which domestic actors become embedded in transnational advocacy networks. So let me talk about each of those. So channels of visibility I have the measures there as well for the quantitative analysis, but the first, social channels, think of the degree to which a state is open for the flow of ideas and images across borders. So that could be, for example, like media that circulates across borders, or television, newspapers, those kind of channels. Political channels is openness to the international society of states that the countries are embedded in. So that could be, for example, numbers of embassies in a country or international organizations joined, multilateral treaties signed. All of these might carry new norms with them. This is, for example, this is a cartoon actually after Ireland passed their same-sex marriage. It's a picture of an Irish couple getting married, and they're passing the bouquet which says gay marriage on it to Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, which they have civil unions in Germany, but they don't yet have gay marriage. So it's showing kind of like she's trying not to catch the bouquet, but it is that kind of international process where states feel pressured. In both Germany and Italy, for that matter, there was a lot of kind of shaming process worked on how these countries could be surpassed, by Catholic Ireland on this issue. Italy did pass civil unions a few months later. Greece also did as well. So we see kind of a trickle effect that's international that that adds to some of the domestic explanations we had before. And then very importantly is this other type of channel, the one that I like to think about the most maybe, which is the presence of local movement actors that become embedded in transnational advocacy networks. And I call them norm brokers because they're the groups that can translate and frame ideas that might be contentious for new audiences. So the categories LGBT, these identities are very context specific. They don't travel easily, and they need a lot of unpacking for distinct contexts. So this is something that these activists do in framing, so presenting and packaging ideas to fashion meetings for a given audience. So how you go about advocating for these rights varies a lot, and if you use the same model everywhere, there's a lot of backlash and a lot of clashes. And I mean, there is nonetheless, but these activists might be better prepared to deal with some of those. And I'll explain then when we get to the case study in detail how this process works a little bit, or at least in the case of Poland. That said, they also channel a lot of things into the context. They shame their states when they don't have receptive states at home. They can put pressure from the outside, so by sidestepping Warsaw to go to Brussels from above, or they bring in resources. They channel human resources people. We'll talk about all of that in a second then. This is, for example, IGA, the International Gay Association, which is now the International Lesbian, Gay, Bi, Trans, and Intersex Association, has been meeting since the late 70s, and there's a long history among sexual minorities, like other marginalized groups that have since the late 1800s have had transnational ties across borders, and this is something that is exemplified in organizations like this. So if these channels matter, then what we should expect to see is that as social and political channels to Europe increase, states should be more likely to adopt LGBT legislation, and as domestic LGBT organizations become embedded in transnational advocacy networks, this is this idea of norm brokers, then states should also be more likely to adopt LGBT legislation. Again, I look at that in the 27 EU member states, and then also with a series of case studies. And I'll, if any of this needs more clarification, you can stop me, or we can talk about case selection more later. But the EU states are an interesting case study because the continent was to some degree divided And even though the Iron Curtain wasn't entirely impermeable, the movements around sexual rights were more developed in the West because of the sexual revolution, because of the HIV/AIDS crisis, different factors that when we think of norm diffusion, where things diffuse from areas where they have gained more standing to areas where they haven't. Europe is an interesting case, and that's why we're talking about. In the book we talk about the continent as a whole, but then we look also at new EU and old EU states separately to compare them. Germany and the EU are one of these, where contexts where activists mobilize to interact with Polish local activists for a target state for changing policies in Poland. That's why those were some of the core case studies. And Poland and Slovenia were two new adopter states that shifted, they changed very differently in their standing on LGBT rights, and that's why they're an interesting comparison as well that appears in the book. I spent a lot of time collecting data for quantitative analysis, and then I was in the field for 25 months during my dissertation work in the core case studies to do interviews, mainly with proponents, but also to the degree that I could access them, also opponents of LGBT rights. All right, so the legislation data set that I'm going to show you here, it spans for 40 years, and it looks at the new EU member states, and the dependent variable, so the outcome that we're interested in is a categorical variable of LGBT rights, and the idea is that you can reach different levels. So it's asking, what predicts the likelihood of higher levels, and the categories that this captures are provisions on sexual offenses, criminal law, anti-discrimination, partnership, and parenting. And then the independent variables have these measures, which I showed you for the core kind of channel variables, but then also a series of other domestic characteristics of the state that might predict this legislation. And what we see here in the new EU member states is, and I'm not showing you all the controls and everything, but just to give you a snapshot, we see that transnational channels that connect states across borders really explain a lot of the variation we see in the degree to which, or the likelihood that states will enact higher levels of LGBT rights law. In fact, much more than many of the things that we think are very important, such as religion or any of the series of factors that we thought to be very important in the early cases. This is a graph looking at the predicted probabilities of change occurring or higher levels of law occurring when norm brokers exist. So when these activists, these transnational activists, are present. And what you see here is that no adoption no laws being adopted is less likely when they're there, and high levels of laws being adopted is more likely when they exist. What's interesting is this low adoption finding here, which shows that they don't really matter for a low level of LGBT rights law. And what's interesting about that is that we've had many studies kind of saying that movements don't matter that much for LGBT rights legislation, but those studies have looked only at decriminalization of sex. So decriminalization of sex is something we've seen in some countries in the 1800s, and then waves of decriminalization in the mid-20th century. Many times states have decriminalized sex not thinking about LGBT people. It wasn't something that a movement asked for always, or something that the state felt it was doing for them. It was just a broader wave. And so this, a broader wave that had to do with various liberal politics, including the sexual revolution. And so the limiting approach is, if we cut the analysis off here, we really miss a lot of what movements are doing, in fact. And we know that LGBT movements ask for more than decriminalization. And so looking at some of these other issues like partnership, parenting, et cetera, are pretty important to include in the analysis. And I think it's pretty convincing that they do matter. So, all right, so I've shown you some patterns across the region. And I want to now turn a little bit to the qualitative cases to think about some of the mechanisms and processes that connect the correlations that we have observed. And the case that one of the cases that I found very interesting and spent a lot of time in was the Polish case. That was a case that in the year 2005, the mayor of Warsaw, that at the time it was Lech Kaczynski, he was later then the president of Poland, but in 2005, he decided to again ban the Equality March. The Equality March is similar to a Pride Parade little bit more political, and on purpose they use a different language, but the Equality March was banned again in 2005, and organizers decided to host it anyways, but they did it strategically with the interaction of a lot of support from other contexts, and that's what they had really worked on, building these ties and getting these people into them. And part of that is embodied here in this image. This was actually from a march in Berlin, and you see a sign here, it says Gay Solidarity, and it has the Polish and the German flag enshrined by the European Union stars. So it's kind of very symbolic of this process. And the logo, Solidarity, with just the Polish flag, was the logo of this actual Solidarity movement. So it's an interesting play on a very local movement in Poland that is then connected to this process of gay rights in a transnational perspective. The organizer, the main organizer, the president of the Polish Equality Foundation, he said, when asked about his activism, he said, I quote, "Through new contacts with European elites, it was easier for me to organize it from Germany than Poland, where the environment was at the time very hostile. In retrospect, these international political pressures were much more important for me than if I would have done this in Poland alone." So what does that mean? Why do international ties matter? What do they deliver to help domestic activism? So one, they bring in human resources. That's at least in this case what happened. That in 2005, it's estimated that a third of the 5,000 marches were actually foreign nationals marching in Warsaw. And they also bring in elite activists or elite politicians that come to support the marches. So by 2006, which was the march the following year, they attracted 32 parliamentarians representing 16 different national governments that marched in Warsaw. Claudia Roth went a couple times to march in Warsaw. She's the chairwoman of the German Green Party, but before that she'd been a European MEP, and she's standing in front of a sign that says, "The foundation of the European Council are human rights." So it shows kind of how you have Europe, how this issue was framed and packaged by these activists to justify her presence there. These ties also bring with them material resources. This is from a survey of LGBT organizations across Europe, and what you can see here is that for new EU member states, so these are usually new adopter states around LGBT rights, you see a large percentage of the budget is international. In fact, 83% of organizations that represent LGBT people have partly international funding, and over half of them have the majority of their budget coming from international contexts. And then they also bring in best practices, from groups that have strategies in other contexts and how to do this. Some of those travel. Not all of those travel, and I think this is important to come back again to the concept of norm brokers, to emphasize that there is a local element to this concept. And these are actors that know their context when these are not just outside actors coming in. And that becomes very important for an issue like this. I mean, you can think of the Warsaw March. So most of those people, most of the outsiders that were taking part were German, and the imagery of Germans marching, for anything in Poland is not a very salient one, because there's a lot of skepticism towards Russian and German involvement in Polish domestic politics, which led rightly to the fear that this activist she's expressing here when she says that in 2005 and 2006 we were afraid we would have the same right-wing propaganda, that the Germans would want to come here and destroy Polish values. And the activists dealt with this by consciously reframing the issue. So it went from Germans marching for LGBT rights. It shifted to being Europeans marching for democratic values and human rights responsibilities. At the time, this was 1-2 years after Polish accession in May of 2004. European, being part of the EU was still a salient trope, and this really worked in, it was still difficult, but it was one way to really connect the issue. And everyone, the people that marched there, they wore T-shirts that said Europa equals tolerancia, so Europe equals tolerance. They wove EU flags, and they consciously diverted any attention from their own domestic context. Like Claudia Roth, who I showed you before, said this has nothing to do with the German-Polish relationship. It has a lot to do with European responsibilities and human rights. So we see, I want to be very careful when we talk about the importance of these transnational ties and saying that we should expect any kind of like major successes to come out of that. I mean, Poland, especially since the last elections last October, is showing again to be a very difficult context for LGBT people. But we do see small outcomes here that are are important and worth mentioning. There's various ways that outcomes are achieved. For one, interacting state authorities and providing protection for LGBT people has been enhanced in some ways. When these, especially when elite actors from other contexts come to a march, they bring with them police protection. You have to keep in mind that when these protests are made illegal, then that means the police are not obliged to, and they don't necessarily protect them, which means it's often too violent for people to actually mobilize. But when Claudia Roth is delivered by the German embassy to the front of the march, in front of a sign, then countries become conscientious about their international standing or the diplomatic crisis that would be, and they bring and they protect those. Volker Beck, who's another German parliamentarian that marched there, he was actually beat up in Moscow at a march. But he said when he marched in Warsaw, he said, when ambassadors join the march, the authorities at the local level have to react differently. They then authorize marches, and the police protect participants instead of protecting the counter demonstrators. So you see this kind of human shield effect for these marches. You also have much more media visibility when outside actors are involved, because they bring with them attention from the media authorities of different contexts, which can then have a cyclical effect of generating more attention and generating more support for that context. And they also engage political parties and elites. We can see that with, for example, the Democratic Left Alliance in Poland, which is a social democratic party that sent, there was about 20 members of the party marched in 2010 at the parade, which is really, for a decade before that, you didn't see that kind of activity, even by left parties. And it was surprising for this party because many of their voters, many of their constituents were agrarian communities that had, their approval of rights for LGBT people was really low. But they marched nonetheless, in part what activists contribute to a socialization process through being members of kind of European parties. Like one of the activists said, this outside influence is motivational. These politicians read the outside stances of their parties, and whether or not they are convinced, they know what it means to be a social democrat in Europe, which includes being open to LGBTs. Polish political parties now have to know about the topic, simply not to embarrass themselves at international congresses. And actually, partnership came very close to being passed in Poland on a few occasions in the last years. It didn't in the end, but a gender recognition bill was passed by the parliament and then vetoed by the new conservative president last year. You do also see changes in the political party landscape, though. This is a picture that I took at the election night of, it was in October 2011, so we're now 2 elections back, but so not the last election, but the one before. And that year, this party at the time, it was called Ruch Palikota, and they got 10% of the vote, which in a parliamentary system for a new party is a pretty impressive actually outcome. And they elected with them the first openly gay man and also the first openly transgender woman into power in that election. And this is Anna Gruszka here, who at the time was the only sitting transgender parliamentarian in federal government in the world and in Poland. So this was really phenomenal. This shows the way the issue was handled, also the way the media and the press talked about this issue. We do see small changes. Again, the current political situation in Poland reminds us that these are long battles, even though we see similar dynamics across groups too. On Monday, many of you probably read in the newspapers about the massive protests around reproductive rights for women, and 24 hours later, the government actually moved a step back from its proposal to put a total ban on abortion. So, and that when those protests happened, they also happened in Berlin and in various European contexts, generating a lot of attention on the Polish case. So we see these dynamics, I think, on other issues and also in other cases. This is not the only case where transnational activism was really active around surrounding LGBT rights. So while we've had some time to think about like positive effects of visibility generated by movements, I think it goes without saying, and it's a really important, actually most of the second half of the book focuses on backlash to visibility. So while visibility can have positive effects, it's also quite common that it creates a response. And I think the important thing to remember is that norms, international norms, are moderated by the domestic context to which they diffuse, and we shouldn't expect all contexts to react to the same visibility in the same way. We see a lot of differences. And in terms of resistance on the streets, where there's really been mobilization against this issue on the streets, that seems to be highest when religion is really strongly embedded in the national identity. I'm not saying that religion on its own is a strong predictor. Actually, I'm not too convinced that it is. But when it becomes embedded as part of the essence of the nation, that's when you see more resistance, because LGBT rights, like gender rights, are seen, in their fluidity to challenge kind of the fixity of national identities. We see that in Poland is one of those cases where the Catholic Church was part of the liberal resistance towards they were part of democratization and resistance against the influence of the Soviet Union in the 80s, and that really created a role for the church in Poland as part of the national identity, and also as part of it gave it a moral authority over a series of issues in Poland. And it wasn't just against resistance in the 80s, it was also resistance against various occupations from outsiders over the course of a long history. That's different in a case like Spain, for example, where the Catholic Church was in democratization, kind of fell on the side of Franco and was really delegitimized, and LGBT rights have not been able to provoke the same type of resistance where they're seen as this outside issue framed as, quote unquote Western issue, or just an issue that doesn't resonate locally. And where we see this kind of national element to these politics, a lot of times we see more resistance on the streets. Whether that resistance is effectual, though, that's another question. There's been scholarship on that where it's a little bit more complicated, and many times the right has accidentally also contributed to making the issue very visible and making it an issue that we have to discuss and think about. And that's definitely happened in some of these contexts. And also, Conrad Dwyer's work at the University of Florida has shown a similar dynamic. We've seen similar arguments in the US where sometimes backlash can inadvertently also further the issue. I'll read you one more quote from an activist in Hungary. She said, "The right wing has become very strong in the past 4 years, but I think there was a favorable shift in the public discourse in response. In 2008, when gay pride happened, it was very violent, and that was a bit too much for people, even for people who thought that the gay pride shouldn't happen. It was so violent and so aggressive. There were between 1,000 and 2,000 marchers and like 5,000 riot police. It was horrible. But the horror made the whole thing more visible. By the whole thing, I mean both extremist violence and gay people. And it was not the gay people anymore in this case who were seen as violating the public morals, but the extremists." So this is not always the way it works, but it's something to think about, the complexity of how visibility interacts with resistance. This is just an image. I thought an interesting cartoon to show you. This is obviously coming from the resistance towards LGBT rights, but it's portrayed, it says, it's being ironic, and it says, "So these are the fascists," and it shows, kind of ordinary looking people waving Polish flags, and it says, "And these are the Poles, ? And it's criticizing this idea of new Poles, but you can see that the gay issue is linked to Europe, as we might expect, because gay activists have done that as well, but it's also linked to the Soviet Union, which makes no sense at all, but it is a way to make LGBT rights seem as external to the nation, something that the nation has to defend itself against. And this is why this link between nationalism and religion can be quite detrimental to the diffusion of LGBT rights. So, in terms of channels of visibility mattering, this was from from a quote with one of the leaders of a movement to oppose LGBT rights in Poland, and he also acknowledged a little bit of a concern of how effective such visibility can be. He said, Poland and the EU are in permanent moral confrontation concerning social issues. The only thing we fear could change that is the increasing outside imagery of this deviant sexual lifestyle as something commonplace, normal, or even appealing for Poland. So there seems to be some recognition about this process on all ends. So I want to end just, if I can have one more minute of your attention. I think it's important to note, that this talk makes a strong case for the effect that transnational movements have on the ability of norms to become visible and salient in the domestic discourse, and that a transnational politics of visibility can empower marginalized people, mobilizing actors to demand change and also influence the spread of norms. But I want to be a little bit cautious about, that takeaway as well. We have many, in line with that more optimistic idea, we have quotes like, if we think of Victor Hugo's quote where he said, "Nothing can stop an idea whose time has come," or if we think about Cesar Chavez's optimism about the civil rights movement when he said, "Once social change begins, it cannot be reversed. You cannot humiliate a person who feels pride or oppress people who are not afraid anymore." I think there is a lot to those quotes, but we have to remember that when we talk about these successes, that these achievements are only experienced by some LGBT people and in some contexts. We can see that even in our own context, and especially if we look at a more intersectional lens of people, LGBT people who still experience really active oppression in also parts of the United States. We're in regions where LGBT people in general experience more or less oppression, or in Europe where we see this. Or if we think of an increasing norm polarization at the international level, where we see strong countries that really advocate in opposition to LGBT rights, such as the traditional values and family values politics of the current Russian regime, that has become very salient in many countries around the world, and in diffusing other types of laws, like laws that are against what is called gay propaganda, where LGBT people and LGBT issues are no longer supposed to be visible at all in the public sphere. So this is still, just a kind of a sober reminder that I do think international channels are really important, and they do seem to be very effective at diffusing rights. But we shouldn't take this as a to suggest that that's the only type of puzzle. In fact, international channels and activism work in the other direction as well. So, and they're pretty successful in that direction too. So, anyways, that's where I will leave it here, and then I'm happy to answer any of your questions. It's a very